Chapter 6. Memorization at the School and Synagogue. In this chapter, we want to explore what level of importance was laid on memorization of the Torah in the homeschool of the biblical period, and the importance of memorization of the oral and written Torah in the school from the rabbinic period and the modern period. We also want to explore the same question in regards to the role memorization played in the synagogue in the rabbinic and modern periods. The student in the biblical period. What importance was given to memorizing and reciting the Bible in the school of the biblical period? The following verses from Deuteronomy encapsulate the ideal curriculum for education in an early Israelite home. Recite them for your children. Say them when you are at home and when you are on the way, when you lay down and when you get up. Teach them to your children, reciting them when you stay at home. Basic to keeping and obeying the words of the Torah in ancient Israel was memorization, repetition, and remembering. Unfortunately, many modern translations usually render the phrase in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and 11, "speak about them," when a better translation is probably to recite or even perform them, that is, the text orally. Anyone can speak about the Torah, but the Torah emphasizes the necessity to memorize and recite or perform it. The Hebrew version emphasizes the aspect of oral presentation to present or quote the text to your audience. In this case, it is the parent to the child. Performing the oral text to the student is the Jewish mode in which instruction happens. This is completely different from modern translations in education, since they turn the process of instruction into an intellectual or interpretive procedure. Speak about them, i.e., speak about the verse's content, talk about the underlying meaning of the words, not the actual words themselves, when the power is in the actual divine words. The words of the Torah are to be orally performed as the basis of all education by the parent or the teacher to the student during all arenas of daily life. Let us consider another portion of the Bible and its understanding of the relationship between education and memorization. Many instructions and proverbs focus on a process that has prominent oral and memorization characteristics, like we earlier saw in the New Kingdom Egyptian texts. Inclining the ear, hearing the words, applying the heart to the sayings are just a few. The student of Proverbs is to memorize the teacher's exact words to keep them within your belly, and then perform them orally. Establish the words on your lips. The tablet of the student's heart was the key focus in the teaching text of Proverbs. A hearing heart, or an open ear, was the oral medium by which the heart received, memorized, and obeyed Torah. The Bible speaks often of having texts written on the table of the heart. The writing metaphor is used to picture a process that is also oral, all of which is focused on the sort of word-for-word, verbatim internalization of the Bible, with the goal of the Bible never to leave the lips of the student so they can be recited and obeyed day and night. Let us continue to explore if the same emphasis put on memorizing in biblical era transcended to the rabbinic period. The student in the rabbinic period. In the rabbinic period, there was obviously a copy of the written Torah available in certain circles, but only an oral Mishnah was available. Actually, not a single written copy of the Mishnah is referred to in the Talmud, where other books and written documents are mentioned. The silence in the Talmud of a written Mishnah underscores its orality. Oral Torah was delivered only from memory in the course of instruction and debates between rabbis and students, and was the basis of all religious education. The fundamental pedagogical element in Jewish education during the rabbinic period was memorization and repetition. Because of the belief in the divine character of the oral and written Torah, it logically led to a lifelong educational principle: a relatively unchanged curriculum, early indoctrination, and a lifelong pursuit. A good pupil fixed and held in the memory Bible verses, the oral law statements, the necessary additions and exposition and indication of its relation to Scripture, and other additional associations intended to explain and illustrate any rabbinic statement. Let us now trace the importance of memorization in the life of a student from elementary education to the college in the religious Jewish world. The student in preschool in the rabbinic period. The term Chinuch would be considered a sort of preschool and points to the purpose of Jewish education of the young boy. As we have already seen, the Bible establishes the Torah to educate your children in Deuteronomy. During the rabbinic period, this duty was incumbent upon fathers and grandfathers and applied to sons and grandsons. As we saw in the biblical period, there was a family-like educational structure for early education. The student is the son, while the teacher is the father. Usually by the age of 3 or so, the child had begun enough to pronounce enough words to begin to memorize. The father was asked to take advantage of the new ability and teach his son to recite from memory 2 verses from Deuteronomy chapter 6. The father would teach him gradually the rest of the chapter of the Shema, which was recited from memory every morning and evening. As he would put on the fringes and eat and drink, he learned to say the required oral sayings from heart. The child lived in an oral world, and as we earlier saw from a modern-day example, this instruction became such a part of the daily routine that he wouldn't even have to try and memorize these commandments. They became second nature over time and repetition. An example of the process from moving from the Chinuch to the scripture school is given by Maimonides. And though he is outside of our time frame, he can still shed light on some principles that likely existed in the rabbinic period. He said in the 12th century, "The father taught the boy little by little, verse after verse, until he was about 6 or 7, all in accordance with his strength, whereupon he led him to the school teacher." The homeschool background in oral and written Torah memorization helped prepare the boy for the first of many stages of a written and oral-based Torah education. The student in scripture school in the rabbinic period. The scripture school provided the basic education for boys in reading and memorizing the Torah in the rabbinic period. The boys would first learn the alphabet from memory and then proceed to studying the oral and written Torah. For training their memory, pupils were made to learn immensely long passages by heart, and these had to be repeated without an omission, without adding or changing a single word. According to the Talmud, schoolboys were quizzed by adults on their Bible memory verses. Among such answers given were from 1st and 2nd Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, and Psalms. Portions of the Bible were committed to memory, and then an attempt at understanding was later undertaken. This educational principle of learn first and then understand was practiced within rabbinic Judaism in connection with the study of Torah. The rabbis went so far as to formulate rules for this procedure. One should always study the Torah and meditate on it afterwards. Not only was the oral Torah passed on by memory in the school, but so were individual doctrinal statements. There are several passages in the Talmud where a student or a teacher consults a rabbi on some doctrinal question or on the wording of some tradition. He learned it from him 40 times, and it became for him as though it lay in a purse. The doctrinal statement in question was passed on through being repeated several times until the student knew the text by heart. The transmission of oral Torah took place on all educational levels in such a way that the teacher equipped his students with the oral text by repeating it as many times as necessary. This seemingly elementary exercise of repetition was actually accorded more importance the higher up in the school system one went. By the time the boy left the scripture school, he would have much of the Bible and Mishnah memorized, at which point many would often move on to study the Talmud in the college. The student in the college in the rabbinic period. During the rabbinic period, the college in Israel was usually called Bet HaMidrash, in Babylonia, the Bet Rav. The advanced study might have started at the age of 10 or somewhat later, depending on the maturity of the student. The origin of the college is obscure, but several texts attest their existence as early as the Tannaitic times. The procedure adopted by Rabbi Akiva when he arranged and orally published the Mishnah in the 1st century AD was the same method of oral transmission that was still used hundreds of years later in the college. The method probably went something like this. Rabbi Akiva taught the Mishnah to the first Tana. Afterwards, Rabbi Akiva taught it to the second Tana in the presence of the first, then to the third, etc. Subsequently, the first Tana repeated the Mishnah to the second, to the third, etc. Then the second Tana recited it to the third, to the fourth, and so on. While descriptions of students repeating their Mishnahot and their oral Torah from heart are common, such acts of memorization were not ends in themselves. They belonged rather to the preparation for the oral presentation before a rabbi in the college. In this sense, the recitation of rabbinic tradition was not comparable to the recitation by a storyteller. Rather, on the model of rhetorical training, students would deliver their memorized texts as part of their larger give and take with teachers and other students. The Jerusalem Talmud is rich in representations of oral interchanges in which two or more colleagues, or teachers and students, are portrayed in dialogical analysis of memorized texts. In some cases, rabbinic disciples were exposed to written materials and might refer to them in case of need, but the overwhelming representation of the Jerusalem Talmud is that resorting to such writings was supplementary to preparation for a learned performance in which such written sources were accessed only through the memory. The principle of literal repetition and memorization of a teacher's words was emphasized and can be seen in a number of passages in the Oral Torah. In regards to an oral law dealing with the bath of purification, Hillel says, "It is a man's duty to state in his teacher's words." The pupil was bound to maintain his teacher's exact wording. But the teacher is also responsible for seeing that the exact wording is preserved. The teacher must repeat it over and over until he has actually passed it on to his students so they know it by heart. The rabbis formulated educational rules on repetition. The rule of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos is said to have been that the teacher had to repeat a doctrinal passage to his pupil 4 times. A man's duty is to repeat to his pupil 4 times. And when the question of the rabbi's repetition for their pupils is taken up, it is the rabbi who is praised. Thus, Rabbi Parida is treated as exemplary. He used to repeat every passage 400 times for a dull pupil, and once when the pupil in question had still not absorbed the passage, he proceeded to repeat it 400 more times. This description gives us a picture of the emphasis on memorization and repetition in the rabbinic college world. The student in the modern period. Let us now explore what level of importance is laid on memorization in the modern period by obtaining our information directly from students in the yeshiva. I made my way to the Silberstein Yeshiva in the Old City, located on the roof of the Shuk, directly across from the Temple Mount, and discussed memorization with a few of the students, of which named Moses was of great assistance. I asked him if he could tell me what is so special about this yeshiva. Moses said, "Out of all the yeshivas in the world, this is one of the very few that is known for its emphasis on memorization of the oral and written Torah. We are a dying breed. The yeshiva world does not emphasize memorization anymore, but this yeshiva does." I asked him to tell me what kind of background in memorization does the average student have that attends here. He said, "Memorization does not start here. In the Mishnah, it tells us how we are to learn. We believe when you are 5 years old, you should start memorizing portions of the 5 books of Moses at school in the morning and the prophets and writings in the afternoon, even if you don't understand the meaning. When you start the 6th grade, you are by now memorizing Mishnah all day, every day. The kids are often quizzed by the rabbis on a verbatim recitation and are awarded prizes for accomplishing such feats. The kids memorize by reading the text aloud and repeating it aloud. When you start the 9th grade, you start memorizing Talmud. As we can see, Moses' testimony concerning memorization and the education system of a boy is pretty much the same today as it was in the rabbinic period. I then asked him if he could tell me how they review what they have memorized. He said, "When a student reaches this yeshiva, it is up to the individual to review what he has previously memorized. Most of us devote an hour or 2 a day to strictly reviewing. We need to constantly review what we have memorized or else we will forget it. But it is sort of like riding a bike. Once you have learned it and done it so many times, it becomes second nature. We normally don't review alone. We will find a partner and sit across from each other with our books open but not looking at the written text and take turns telling what we know from memory. We do not do this with the Tanakh only with the oral Torah. If one of us draws a blank, then we can look for help from our partner or look down at the text for assistance." Knowing what the rabbinic sources say about the importance of repeating, I asked Moses what techniques they use to memorize. He said, "We don't use any special techniques to memorize. Most of what we have memorized is from just repeating it verbally over and over again." Again, we see the primary memorization tool the students use is verbal repetition. Also, knowing how the Shas Polak relied on the format of the page as an aid to memorization, I asked him to comment on the format of the printed page and its advantage to memorization. He said, "The way the text is arranged on the page aids in memorization. The format of the page helps us to remember what is written where, and by repetition, the page becomes sort of photographed on our minds." As we earlier saw with the Shas Polak, the format of the page is still a key mnemonic to aid memorization. I then asked him why they memorize particular portions of their texts instead of others. He said, "We memorize certain passages in the Talmud and Mishnah more than others because they are more applicable to our daily life. For example, we wouldn't emphasize memorizing passages in the Talmud that deal with the sacrificial system in the temple because, well, the temple is no longer available. We know the Tanakh well, but the idea is not to go out to memorize the Bible. I finally asked Moses, how much do the students at this unique yeshiva actually have memorized? He said, in the yeshiva world, very few people know all the Mishnah from memory. Of all the men in our yeshiva, about 10 know just about the whole Mishnah from memory. Most of the men here know about 90 to 80% of the Mishnah from memory. Almost everyone here knows just about half of it from heart. As we have seen from his testimony, the emphasis placed on memorization in the rabbinic world today is considerably rare. Moses pointed out to me numerous times that from his experience, very few yeshivas emphasize memorization like the one he attends, and this concurs with Rabbi Shlomo's testimony as well. It is safe to say that your average yeshiva student would have fundamental prayers, oral law statements, and a few Bible passages memorized, but in no way compared to the excellence given to memorization at the Silberstein Yeshiva. As Moses said, we are a dying breed. The yeshiva world does not emphasize memorization anymore, but this yeshiva does. The synagogue in the rabbinic period. Let us now consider the emphasis placed upon memorization in the rabbinic period synagogue setting. The synagogue, like the school, made concerted efforts to facilitate memorization for professionals and lay people alike. In the synagogue, the Bible was to be read from the book, despite the fact that the reader usually knew the text by heart. This is the same testimony today. The Targum, on the other hand, must not be read from the book, but delivered from memory. The translator of the weekly Torah portion from Hebrew into Aramaic, the Targumim, stood alongside the Hebrew reader and translated verse by verse from memory to the congregation. The rabbis forbade his reading the Targum from a written text, lest the congregation get the false impression that the Torah was originally written in Aramaic. This required the Targum to recite his translation entirely from memory. Also, the Torah reader and the Targum reader must not be one and the same person. The former might not help the latter with the translation, and the Targum reader might not begin reciting before the Torah reader is finished. The weekly or even daily hearings of the spoken Torah would facilitate its memorization to the lay people. Among the discovered Geniza fragments are 4 examples of Targum written in shorthand and all on miniature manuscripts. Shorthand texts of the Bible and of the Mishnah, comprising only the first letter of each word or the first word of each verse, were, until their finding, not known. These were produced in medieval times as aids for speaking the memorized translation, or Targum. The reduced size of the Targumic shorthand manuscripts suggests that they were mnemonic devices prepared by the translator for inconspicuous use during the reading of the Torah portion in case his memory drew a blank. By referring to the abbreviated notes, the translator would not technically be violating the rabbinic rule of not reading the Targum from a book. It was a given that the translator knew the text being read by the cantor from heart and thereby could easily translate it to the audience. Until the 7th century, the tradition of the cantillation of the Torah was handed down orally, as we earlier saw was a function of the Tana. The rabbi had forbidden the introduction of any signs or markings in the Torah scrolls, which meant the entire spoken cantillation had to be memorized verbatim. However, when it became customary to write the punctuated Torah in book form, special signs were introduced to guide the speaker in the proper pronunciation and intonation. It was the sages of Tiberias in the 9th and 10th centuries that perfected the system of vocalization. Seeing that there were no markings or vocalization signs in the scrolls from which the public reading of the Torah was made, the readers had to prepare themselves through memorizing their oral performance. The cantor, or chazan, had many functions, one of which was to lead the congregation in prayer and singing. The qualifications for a cantor in the Talmudic period were one who is meek and is acceptable to the people, who is skilled in chanting with a pleasant voice and possesses a thorough knowledge of Scripture, the prophets, and who is conversant with the Mishnah and the benedictions. In other words, these men had to know intimately or have memorized all the oral and written Torah, and also had to be able to memorize liturgical texts in accordance with the need of the hour or the occasion. Leading a service became a matter of memory because it was still forbidden at this time to write down prayers. Those who write down prayers are like those who burn the scriptures. As the number of prayers grew, it became more difficult to memorize all of them, so 2 men were assigned to stand next to the cantor to serve as possible memory prompters. Just how much the lay people knew from memory by the oral proclamation of the Torah in the rabbinic period we do not know. We may assume many, as we have several records of Jerome's accounts in the 4th century of lay people who have a high knowledge of the memorized word by their continual hearing of the orally proclaimed scriptures in the church service. What was the emphasis on the memorization of liturgy and doctrines in the synagogue setting? Rabbi Akiva, wishing to illustrate the way Moses and the people had sung the song at the Red Sea, said it was recited in the same fashion as the miner who reads the Hallel in the Bet HaSefer, and the others repeat after him every sentence. Rabbi Joseph the Galilean says, as the man who reads the Hallel in the synagogue, and the others repeat after him the first part of each sentence. The teaching of the Hallel accordingly proceeded in the following manner. The teacher would recite a sentence in the school, and then make the class repeat it verbatim. As soon as the pupils were able to recite the sentence by themselves, the teacher called on individual boys to lead the responsive reading of the group. But while the congregation in the synagogue would repeat only the first part of each sentence, the boys in the school repeated the whole sentence, so that ultimately they should be able to act as cantors of the memorized service in the synagogue. The synagogue in the modern period. In order to get an authentic understanding of the role memorization plays in the modern-day synagogue service, I interviewed a professional cantor, Dr. Rabbi Abraham Feather of Jerusalem. I asked him if the qualifications required for a cantor during the rabbinic period and the role of the translator were still applicable today. He said, the Talmudic passage relating to the requirements of a cantor is an ideal statement, and though we would all love to stick to the ideal that all cantors have such accolades, it is not possible in today's world. As for the role of the Targum or translator, most communities do not use one today, though some do, such as the Yemenites. I then asked Rabbi Feather to explain the role of memorization in the synagogue today. He said, the role of the Chazan or cantor is vital to the flow of the service. The greatest mnemonic tool in the synagogue today and at the disposal of the cantor is music and repetition. A melody associated with the Bible verse fosters memorization for the cantor and the lay people alike. Across the board of the different streams of Judaism today, music such as ancient Middle Eastern melodies greatly assists in memorization of the Bible and liturgy. I asked him about the role of memorization in young people in the service. He said, the familiarity and memorization of the Bible is ideally taught from early childhood when children memorize the different musical notes for chanting the Bible and prayers. As a general educational principle, memorizing is very helpful for young people, and the younger one starts memorizing, the better and longer it stays with them. Every bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah requires that the young person memorize how to correctly chant their Torah portion, and those who feel led in this direction can receive training to become a professional cantor. I asked him about the musical patterns used by cantors in the synagogue service today. He said, "There is a set pattern for musical themes that cantors use. There is a strict pattern recommended for different services. A weekday has one set of musical themes, the Sabbath another set, holiday and high holiday services yet another set. These musical patterns, experienced over time, become familiar with the lay people, who can then associate a particular musical melody to a certain text and thereby be more readily able to memorize it." I asked him about the memorization of the Bible in the service. He said, "As part of the liturgy, there are biblical texts inserted into the rhythmic liturgy, such as the Shema, which is recited daily in the prayer service. Because many of the texts are tied to a melody and are repeated so frequently, many lay people have portions of the Bible memorized. Memorization is a wonderful system, and the best helpmate to memorize is putting the biblical and liturgical text to music. The quantity of biblical text chanted by a cantor in the service varies with the different denominations. Orthodox generally read a maximum amount of Bible verses. The Reform cut out many of the biblical texts, and the conservatives are somewhere in the middle. The more traditional the service, the more Hebrew texts are spoken. Nevertheless, whatever the denomination or the amount of the text being chanted, music is the key mnemonic feature for memorization in the synagogue. Conclusion, Chapter 6. As we have seen, memorization was emphasized from many angles within the school and synagogue service. It was expected for children to be taught the memorized Torah by their parents in all walks of daily life. The oral recitation of the memorized Torah by the parent was the essential curriculum for the child in the biblical period. In the rabbinic period, we saw that a child was expected to memorize the Shema and many of the oral law statements before he entered the scripture school. Once in the scripture school, tremendous emphasis was given to memorize long passages of the Bible, along with the Mishnah and doctrinal statements. At the college level, the student could be expected to review continually what he had previously memorized, along with now accumulating long memorized portions of the Talmud by the practice of verbal repetition. In the rabbinic period synagogue, the cantor, though he read from the text, likely had it memorized, and the Targum reader or translator had previously memorized the text in Hebrew and could easily translate it into the common vernacular. The lay people would have learned many passages by heart from their continual hearing and reading of the text in the service. The liturgy was sung with the congregation interacting with the cantor, which easily fostered memorization because of their hymnic style, and doctrinal statements were formed by the rabbis in such a way to make them easy for the congregation to memorize. Finally, as we saw from Rabbi Feder, the greatest mnemonic tool in the synagogue service today is music, accompanied by the chanting of the biblical text and liturgy. The melody that accompanies the oral proclamation of the text facilitates memorization not only for the cantor, but for the lay people alike. Memorization is still alive in the world of the synagogue due to mnemonics such as music, but generally speaking, memorization within the yeshiva world can be summed up by the students from the Silberstein Yeshiva. We are a dying breed. The yeshiva world does not emphasize memorization anymore.